This is a detailed overview of our Porsche 911 993 Carrera. It's our first 993 that we've pushed off the production line. We've got 3 more in tow behind this, which I'm quite excited about. So I guess it goes without saying that we're quite vested in, a number of our clients are too, in this series and our approach to this series. I'm going to be covering an overview of the 993 generally. I'll certainly be diving into the derivatives of the different 993s and how it has informed the approach we've taken with this build, and in fact all the builds that we're doing on round 993. We'll be taking a drive in the car and I'll come back and then I'll focus in on the aesthetics. I've specifically chosen a time of day which is quite critical from a light point of view. It's a lovely late winter's afternoon here in Johannesburg, South Africa. But I wanted a lot of light on this car because there's so much detail inside the paintwork that I wanted everybody to see. So we'll come back to aesthetics. But just to kind of give you an insight into what it is that we're going to be covering as we go through this process, is some, I would think, some relatively contentious views around our kind of idea of what comprises, in inverted commas, the best 993. Best being, of course, by measure of a certain set of criteria, which I'll take you through. So, I'm going to be talking about our approach, and where the contentious element comes in is that, as I'm pointing out now, our decision has been to focus on the 993 Carrera, which is, although hard to believe from this angle, given the beautiful breadth of this car, is in fact the narrow body derivative of the 993, as against the wide body derivative, which one found the 2S, the 4S, the Turbo, and the GT2. Now, what many don't realize, and I find quite telling in fact, is that the narrow body car in fact was the choice for the 993 Carrera RS, and well, arguably for the pinnacle of performance for the 993 Cup car, for kind of out and out racing purposes. And I find it really interesting that the narrow body cars kind of were used, let's call it, intermittently between these different ranges, and which one then is the best for what purpose. And effectively we're going to get all the way around in a full circle to why we believe that what we've done with this car is, in inverted commas, the best we believe one can do to a kind of a 993 driving car. We'll qualify that as we go. Okay, so first off, we're going to cover an overview, kind of generally the 993, not without any major detail. The internet is filled with this information should you want it, but let's cover that quickly. This is a very short, in fact the shortest run of any specific series that Porsche ever had, and it ran from 1994 through to 1998. That's 4 years. Only, well, 1 year shorter in fact than the 964 that preceded it. The average model run now is 9 to 10 years, and in fact the G series that came before the 964 was in fact 15 years long. So this is a very short production run that Porsche ran these 993s for. It certainly has added to their collectability, just given the sheer numbers that were produced. Very rare cars, just broadly speaking, given how few of them were made in that short space of time. There are slightly fewer 964s produced, 63,800, but what followed in the 996 is 176,000 996s came after the 993. But the 996 basically was the start of the, let's call it the production, the ramped up production that Porsche had started to get into. Whereas the 993 effectively is not only the last of the kind of, let's call it the micro, in relative terms, numbers that they produced within a series, but also, yes, the very last of the air-cooled cars of the 911s. And hence, the 993 is that beautiful bookend to the last of the 911 air-cooled era. It makes it highly collectible for that reason. Inside of that 68,800, and I'm going to start now inkling towards the contentious bit, 46,000 of those cars were what we call the narrow body cars. 22,000 of them carried the wider rear. The wider rear being obviously the wider rear wheels. The fronts remain pretty much the same throughout all the series, but the rear and the rocker panel design and the rear bumper changed design, and obviously there were the likes of the the wings that started to appear in the turbos and the RSs and so on and so forth. But 22,000 were wide body. And to just kind of quickly put an underline on it, one of the most kind of sought after, and for good reason, given their rarity, sought after models is the 993 Carrera S, which is the wide body version of this car, and the 4S, which is kind of the four-wheel drive version of that. We'll get into that later because there's a few interesting facts around that a lot of people are not aware of. But kind of the second rarest series of the 911s and the last of the air-cooled make it very special. How it differed, very briefly, fundamentally differed in almost every aspect from a body point of view. The only element of a 993 that is carried over from the 964 is in fact the roofline, or the panel of the roof. The glass is not shared. New glass, new doors, new fenders, new shape bonnet, etc. Every visible body part is new. The interior, whilst it feels very much the same, also a number of key changes. And yes, they certainly do look quite a bit different to a 964 that preceded it. What I find interesting from a personal point of view is that when one drives a 993, you get a great degree of, let's call it, recognition, kind of that raised eyebrow and a slight smile from people who are familiar with the 911 ranges and understand how rare the 993s are and why they are so sought after, and let's call it appreciate them for a number of reasons, not purely aesthetics. Whereas the average person who's not a Porsche fundy tends to look at these and because they sit on the cusp of looking classic, as in they're not new Porsches, but also quite new at the same time, I tend to find that the average person will still gravitate from a pure sheer liking point of view to the earlier cars, the F-Series, the iconic F-Series, and even to some extent the G-Series. And the 964 now has got its own appeal as well. Either way, these are very much recognized and very much appreciated by the Porsche, let's call it Porscherati, or the people that understand what goes into them. And they are, without a doubt, the very end of that classic envelope, because beyond this, they go to the 996 and then design changes become quite significant. Let's maybe go and take a drive in the car. And once we've taken that drive, you'll start to get an idea of what it is that differs between the different series, and why it is that we decided that the key car we were going to focus in on was that narrow body. And by now you will also probably have picked up a few little design elements which will start to kind of create some debate. So let's take a drive and we'll come back. Okay, we've spoken about the aesthetic differences in the 993 within the broader 911 series, and some of the distinctive differences within the 993 series. But now let's take a drive, and I want to try and just articulate a few key differences between the 993 and its predecessor, the 964, quite briefly, and then talk about what we've done with this car and the build objective. So first thing is coming out of the 964. So 964, 250 odd horsepower, base level. 993 base level, 270 odd horsepower. So there's more power coming through, and we'll talk about some of the detail of that if we get some time. But there are really key two differences, or kind of the two key things that make for the difference in terms of how a 964 drives versus a 993. And they come down to, yes, the motor, which we'll touch on, but certainly the suspension. So the design of the suspension within the 993 is fundamentally different. One of the bigger, kind of more obvious overhauls between the two models, aside from aesthetics, significantly lighter in terms of aluminium components, and also kind of uses this kind of thinking Weissach axle, which makes for one was designed, and is a very clever piece of kit, but kind of basically in short, kind of simple terms, assists in minimizing the chance of snap oversteer that the 911s are so wonderfully renowned for. So in layman's terms, when you drive a 993, it will feel different. It feels significantly more planted, and it feels like a more modern car. It still has the benefits of feeling like a classic car, or a somewhat classic car, because it's direct and there's a sound note to it, and you can feel everything in the car. It doesn't feel like today's almost remote controlled kind of driving experiences at all, but it is on the very edge of that classic feel into contemporary. And I would say certainly the most distinctive difference is how the car feels when it drives based on its suspension. The motors, without getting into too much detail because it can get a little bit boring, the 993 4 valves per cylinder throughout, big difference. Direct overhead cams, in-cam Varioram, by the way, technology halfway through the run, which is the ability to dynamically, based on the engine speed, kind of shorten and lengthen basically kind of the valve intakes, kind of how much air was coming in and out of these motors. Anyway, long story short, still an air-cooled motor. Quite a bit of debate online about whether the 993 was in fact intended to be water-cooled or not. By all the research that I can do, there certainly was the plan to upgrade the motors within the 993 series to water-cooled before the 993 series ended, but they ultimately pulled out of that and it retained its air-cooled motor. But throughout its life cycle, the water-cooled motor had been developed and was ready for launch in the 996. It does make for the kind of this important bookend to the 911 air-cooled series, and that certainly does add a lot of cachet to the collectability of these cars. But in terms of key differences coming out, that's it. Suspension, motor, yes. The interior, the cabin, the proportions are slightly different, but they feel much the same, except for obviously the suspension, a little bit more power. But let's talk about the S versus the non-S spec. Now, this is significantly more interesting to me. One would think that a 993 Carrera 4S or 2S would certainly be faster, in inverted commas, than a stock standard Carrera, and it's not the case. So whilst on paper Porsche kind of published that there's 0.1 of a second between them in favor of the S models, practically everybody that any motoring journalist that tested these cars at the time found that the base model Carrera would in fact outperform the 4S and indeed the 2S. And that's not really very surprising because they all carry the same motors. There is no power increase between the standard Carrera and the 2S and the 4S. In fact, what there is the penalty of weight. You've got the 4S, which is 120 odd kilograms heavier than the standard Carrera, 80 odd kilograms, 70 to 80 odd kilograms heavier than the 2S. And that's just because, all the S models are carrying wide hips, bigger side skirts. So that penalty, that weight penalty, basically just leads to a lower kind of torque to weight ratio. And you shouldn't be surprised that a base model Carrera is faster than a 2S and a 4S. Around a track, it gets a little bit more complicated to come to that simple kind of conclusion. The 4S came out with sport suspension. Let's talk about that kind of a little bit, shall we? 1994, out comes the Carrera 993. 1995, out comes the turbo model. Very expensive piece of kit that or model that Porsche launched there. You're talking about obviously a whole lot of motor development, but you've got body panels, new kind of rear body panels. You've got a front turbo bumper. You've got side skirts. You've got suspension components, and it's expensive to create all those tools, to create all of those parts. Anyway, out comes the turbo. They had a degree of success with the launch of that turbo in 95, and then in 96 they launched effectively the non-turbo turbo. Looks like a turbo but ain't a turbo, and that's the 993 4S. And I say it somewhat facetiously, but that really is it. You've got the 4S was the turbo body with the turbo brakes and the turbo sport suspension, but without the turbo motor. And it carries around a lot more weight, and what would you expect? But on a track, given the wider track of that car, at high speed you're going to get a slight advantage in terms of how that car feels, and around a track you may well get a certain benefit of the suspension, but pure acceleration, straight line speed and average driving, no faster. Then in 97 out comes the Carrera 2S, and beautiful car, all the looks of the 4S, beautiful split wheel in the rear, same motor, and in fact didn't even get the benefit, unless you spec'd it, of the sport suspension. So now what you've got is a car that's carrying exactly the same power as the base model, but it's got a whole lot of cool stuff sitting around it, and you can then flaunt. So to be totally cruel, and this is what the purists say. I wouldn't class myself as a purist, so I'm quoting them. Now, the 2S and 4S were somewhat poser cars, whilst the Carrera was a driver's car. I think that's a little bit harsh. I think if you spec the 2S and the 4S correctly, just given their absolute beauty, they are quite remarkable. But on paper, and based on the fact that they share the same power plant, 270, 280 odd horsepower, with some Ram technology, sorry, you've got yourself some expensive fenders. Now, that's cruel, I know, and let's just also then counter that argument. One of the most valuable models within the 911 kind of series as a whole, air-cooled that is of course the 993 2S. 1 year only model car, 3,600 odd of them were made, extremely rare, utterly beautiful, and command a price premium of at least 3 times over that of a standard Carrera in standard base spec. The 4S not quite as valuable, but certainly commands a premium. So, the market gets what the market wants, and the more the demand, the fewer the models, the higher the price. So, if you're holding on to a 2S, don't worry, you've got an amazing car. But if we get back to being on paper, and if we were going to try and build the perfect 993, what would it be? And that's really what leads me to the build brief on this car. Now, I said to the client, and I'll pull off, but let's keep going. I said to the client when we built this car, I believe that the narrow body is the better car, because frankly, it is on paper. But the aesthetics of the S cars are just so utterly beautiful. I'll build you a car that will outperform an S, which certainly isn't difficult since we start pretty much at a base level. But it'll have all the looks of an S, and in fact, let's call it this, it'll drive, it'll be better than any S. Simple brief, I guess, but here's what we did. We then took all of the best aesthetic components out of the S, and there's not many of them. We're looking at the turbo front bumper, beautiful, and changes the look of the car significantly. The rear split grille, just because it's purely aesthetic, it has no role to play, it's not any more aerodynamic, it doesn't give you any more downforce at the back. But basically it's those two components. It's certainly the turbo twist wheels, which have to be able to fit on a narrow body. There's a specific code for those. Some very special hollow spoke versions of those wheels as well are available. And effectively we could aesthetically mimic an S, not mimic, but we could build a car that carries these beautiful, recognizable S aspects of the S, but retain the benefits of the narrow body. The narrow body is lighter, 70, 80 odd kilograms lighter, and hence you're going to get a better torque to kind of, weight ratio by deleting those wide hips. Ultimately, and this is my personal opinion, and I could well be wrong, and everybody has a right to their own opinion, I would argue that aesthetically, a narrow-bodied car that carries the turbo front bumper design, as well as the kind of the rear split grille specifically, to me just feels significantly more balanced, I believe, than in fact the wide body cars. It doesn't carry the same cachet from a collectability point of view, but aesthetically, in my opinion, it works. And it's not that easy, by the way, to get that balance right, certainly by way of the stance of the car. But aesthetics, done. The car looks, again, to my eye, beautiful. And it performs better. But we now wanted to take that a few steps forward. What else is it that it carries that makes it even better? And herein sits a few other kind of key upgrades. RS spec, lightweight flywheel and clutch. It just allows that motor to gain and lose revs far more responsively. It's swinging a far lighter flywheel. The car will pick up speed significantly more quickly, and it just feels it is faster and it feels faster. We've also got a lot more air running through that motor. Obviously the motor's been rebuilt in full. It's got a performance chip in it. Still Porsche, the Porsche engine management system in terms of ECU, but the chip that then controls certain aspects of that is upgraded, and you can get a lot more out of that. In fact, we need that chip specifically to be able to handle how it is that the lightweight flywheel, just listen to that, how the lightweight flywheel and clutch behave and kind of retain their revs. So upgraded chip for better performance, more air running through the motor in terms of performance, filtration and so on, fully rebuilt of course. We've also got a short shift gear lever. That's not going to save you any time around a track, arguably, but just in terms of the tightness and how this car feels, it is wonderful. We also have carbon Recaro seats in this car. Takes out a fair whack of weight, which is good, and it gives you the right amount of support to let the car feed back to you exactly where it is. I will bet anybody that they'll take a bunch of seconds off their time around a track by having a performance seat. You drive better with a performance seat, and you lose a little bit of weight along the way. So here's what we've done, and I don't want to overcomplicate this. And I believe, by the way, that the best recipes are the most simple recipes, and this is effectively a very simple recipe. It is to take what is now in its own right, even in relative terms, still a very rare car, but there are at least a few of them out there, which is a 993 Carrera. Pre-Variaram, post-Variaram really doesn't make too much difference, to be honest. You then make it better, and you make it better in a very considered and somewhat, let's call it, I don't know, respectful way to what Porsche intended, and you give it some let's call it aesthetic enhancements that I must honestly admit are, I think, some of the most beautiful designs that Porsche have ever put out. Tony Hatter, the design, did the most incredible job. But you take the best of the aesthetics from the S series, and then you take what is a fundamentally amazing motor, a really good setup from a suspension point of view, and you make it better. I don't think I mentioned that the car as well has got sport suspension. So a very key point, in fact, which is if you're wanting to match kind of that feel that a 4S gives you in terms of its ability to perform, and you want to kind of give it some wheelie on the corners, you're going to need to upgrade your suspension to sport suspension, and we do that with these builds as well. So suspension, a little bit more power in terms of chip and management, more responsiveness in terms of clutch, flywheel, a feel in terms of the gear change, air as I mentioned coming through the car, and these seats to hold you tight. And what you then get is an aesthetic package that I believe is, to my eye, even better, and a performance package that is really an amazing car to build. This car picks up revs super easily. There's a nice little power band to be found here at around the 4,500 mark. She turns beautifully, she handles beautifully, she goes to a speed well beyond the fine that I'm prepared to pay. I'll let the client determine the edges of that envelope when he takes delivery of his beautiful new vehicle. But you get a car that is both unique and, in my opinion, quite wonderful. Right, let's talk about color. This car's got a very distinctive color. It's a metallic brown, and our view on paint is, well, we take it very, very seriously in terms of color. And I need to give my client credit for, in fact, putting us onto this route. We were discussing different approaches for colors, and I've got a preference for matching types of colors with certain series of cars. We spent a lot of time thinking that through and kind of mixing up colors. But in our view, kind of the late 80s and 90s cars are definitely, in our opinion, they benefit in certain cases from being metallic. They're just age appropriate. There's nothing wrong with a flat color car, in other words, non-metallic, but there definitely is a range of options that you can play with when it is appropriate to be using metallics. And our view is that on a 90s car, that's very much the case. So just to talk quickly about kind of the technology of paint. When I say a metallic paint, there are flecks of metal inside of that paint. And already inside there, you should be picking up yellows and reds and greens. And those are physically little pieces of metal, which are reflecting light, and they've got a color to them. Behind that or around that sits the base coat color, and beyond that then sits obviously clear coat that then gives it a shine. But you've got multiple layers of variables to work with when mixing metallic colors. It's like 3D paint mixing. It's not just a single color. It behaves in different ways based on how the light strikes it, the low lights and the highlights. You can change effectively the toner or the color of the metal fleck, and obviously you can change the paint color that sits around it. We mixed this paint over the course of a few days, and we took a very nice brown, in fact, from the BMW stable called chestnut brown, which was somewhat red and let's call it chestnutty, and we worked backwards from there, and we effectively started to change the color of the toners little bit by little bit, and then darkened the low lights until such time as we achieved a very important thing, which will be called a flick. And that flick is how it is that a metallic paint looks flat, which is it turns into what I call a non-metallic at certain angles. And this is a good time of day, which is why we're doing it at this time of day, where that doesn't appear to be a metallic car. It doesn't look metallic, it doesn't appear metallic, and in fact it appears to be fundamentally a flat brown, which we wanted to mimic Porsche's mocha brown with, which is almost like an oil slick black, a very kind of dark rich brown. So this car turns from brown at certain angles to, when it catches the sun, that beautiful kind of metallic brown. Okay, let's have a look at the interior. And obviously, critically important aspect of every car that we build. And in this case, given the brown, which we spent quite a bit of time on, it was a natural choice for us to use our Dutchmann tan leather. We've got a few different derivatives of this. But you'll notice that we're also kind of keeping things very simple. We could put Pasha in here and all sorts of wild and exciting patterns, but in my view, I find that somewhat distracts from what we're trying to achieve. We always have a complementary stitch color, which is the color of the stitch matches the color of the leather. And what I really quite like, and you'll see it there, is the carbon seat detail. I believe just adds a really beautiful kind of degree of sophistication offset against this brown. So interior, nothing much really new that you may or may not have seen before. You know, she's got her full 4 seats, as impractical as they may be. She's got the carbon recorders, as I've mentioned. She's got a lovely Porsche PCCM head unit. And in this car specifically, we also spent quite a bit of time putting a really nice bit of sign together for her. So she's got high-powered split system down here. It's quite difficult to get great lower, mid-range and lower frequencies out of a 911 because there's so little space for the sound waves to build. But what we also then have is hidden below these beautiful Recaro seats, or carbon racing seats, are hidden subwoofers, which give us all of our low bass tones. So she's got really good sound, which is something which I, in the early cars, I've always trying to get people to steer clear of, because I don't think it's particularly important because of the engine note. But my goodness, when you start to, I don't know, spend a bit more time in these cars, there's nothing wrong with a nice bit of sound too. Okay, let's wrap up in the fading light of the afternoon. With regards to our approach to the 993, we're very much focused in on the 993 Carrera, the narrow body car. My view is that it is a car that should be celebrated. The original choice by Dieter Rams to drive, and in fact Steve Jobs, Dieter Rams of Braun fame, and Steve Jobs needs no introduction. These are absolute design icons, and the base level Carrera from a proportion point of view is the car which we think really deserves a bit of attention, and in fact serves as a better basis for our driving experience. We believe that when you treat them right, and you put kind of the right bits and pieces into them, and you travel back in time, effectively putting yourself on the production line back in 1995, I would personally choose a narrow body car, and then I would start to spec up from there. We haven't even got into what it is that one can do with these motors if you really want ultra high performance. These cars are really high performance as it is. We can only go up from there. There'll be a separate probably focus on motors as we get through that development cycle. But these cars are extremely good base cars to work with. And then with the small refinements that we make, our view is that this is, again, by our own measure, the best that a 993 can be from a daily driving, let's call it celebration and enjoyment of what is kind of the bookend to the 911 air-cooled era. There is not much that hasn't been said about the 993 in terms of its collectability and why it is that it's so sought after. Our view was that we just wanted to come in and say a few things that no one had potentially said before, and talk a little bit about a few aspects of this car that people may or may not be that familiar with. All in all, there is no such thing as a bad 993. A coupe, a Targa, a narrow body, a wide body, an RS, you know, even a GT2. Our view is that if you're going to do something unique and something special, this is how we would do it. But yeah, thanks very much for watching.